and human rights. That's the message from guests commemorating Nelson Mandela International Day at the United Nations in New York.
The UN boss, Antonio Gutteres, says Mandela remains one of the most inspirational leaders of our time. Meanwhile, Tourism Minister Mmamoloko Kubayi-Ngubane is urging UN member states to honor Madiba's legacy by redoubling efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Agenda by 2030.
We pay tribute to an extraordinary global advocate.
Those gathered here reminded that Madiba would have been 101 years old today, a life exemplified by courage, compassion, and a commitment to freedom, peace, and social justice. With the UN last year declaring 2019 to 2028 the Nelson Mandela Decade of Peace.
As we enter the first year of the decade, many conflicts continue with no sign of an end. The multilateral system we have built is under strain, and human rights are under siege from many quarters. In response, let us be guided by Nelson Mandela's courage and wisdom to stand up for the values and principles of the United Nations Charter. Our best tribute to a full life that Nelson Mandela devoted to the struggle for human rights is found in actions.
Among the keynote speakers, this human rights lawyer, who famously stood alongside Madiba when he voted for the first time in 1994.
Nelson Mandela has left a challenge not only for South Africans, but for all of us who live in the wake of his life. Will we make choices in our lives and work, and indeed in the international policies made in this great institution, the General Assembly of the United Nations? Will we make choices that reflect the ideals of justice and the example of courage that are his legacy to humanity?
This New York City official was part of the organizing committee that welcomed Madiba on his maiden trip to the United States after his release in 1990.
His first trip out of Africa when he was released from prison was to New York City. And when he came, 2 million New Yorkers came out in the streets to greet him. This was because the courage, sacrifice, and aspirations of the South African people for a non-racial, equitable, and democratic society was already widely admired by people here in New York. Nelson Mandela not only represented the people of South Africa, he represented us too.
As the case was made for Madiba's legacy to inspire the global development agenda, which requires a much-needed jolt.
While extreme poverty has eased considerably since the 90s, pockets of the worst form of poverty still persist, not least on the continent of Africa. In honor of the legacy and values espoused by Mandela, and in upholding the founding principles of this august international governmental body, we should, as member states, redouble our efforts in the full implementation of the 2030 agenda. We must further utilize the International Nelson Mandela Day to interrogate and reflect on what more can be done to enhance our universal social protection systems and what sorts of targeted measures we can employ to reduce extreme poverty by 2030.
The message clear. By delivering on the 17 goals contained in the SDGs, the world would in so doing be appropriately honouring the legacy of this global icon. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
To tell us more about Mandela Day at the UN in New York, we're joined by our correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on The Globe. Now, before we talk about Mandela Day, we understand the United States has shot down an Iranian drone.
Yeah, breaking news coming to us from the mouth of President Donald Trump. He has basically made an announcement that the United States, a warship, has shot down an Iranian drone. We do not have the details, but this is yet another escalation. As you'll know, weeks ago, the Iranians shot down a United States drone that they argued had infiltrated its international territories, international airspace. And of course, we had an emergency Security Council meeting here at the United Nations to deal with this issue. The Iranian Foreign Minister, Mohammad Zarif, is currently in New York attending the high-level political forum on the Sustainable Development Goals. He is due, Lulu, to meet with the Secretary General in about 20 to 25 minutes. So as soon as we are done here, we're going to rush to the entrance where he's due to arrive at the United Nations. We are told that he might stop and talk to reporters. So this will be the first reaction from a high-level Iranian official in response to this latest escalation. The United States shooting down a drone. The little bit we understand is from the President of the United States, Donald Trump, is that this drone had received numerous warnings that it was coming too close to the warship. It was then shot down, but of course this has not yet been verified by the SABC. And of course, as I mentioned to you, we'd like to get out of this and rush down to that entrance so that we can get a word from Mohammad Zarif, the foreign minister who happens to be in New York at this time.
All right, Sherwin, just to get back to one of the biggest stories on the globe today, International Mandela Day being celebrated all over the world. Can you describe the mood at the UN today?
Well, this is the decade since the first Mandela Day was inaugurated at Radio City Music Hall here in New York. The likes of Aretha Franklin, Josh Groban, Stevie Wonder really setting the stage for the General Assembly's adoption of a resolution in November of 2009. And now we have really what is a tradition here at the United Nations, really a mood. Not somber, Lulu, but tempered excitement given the challenges that face the world today. What we saw today in that commemoration was numerous officials trying to make a direct link between the social justice legacy of former President Nelson Mandela and the work that remains within the multilateral system here at the United Nations, particularly achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. You will know that eradicating poverty was very close to the heart of our first black democratically elected president in South Africa, and that happens to be goal 1 of the SDGs, eliminating severe poverty by 2030. What are some of the other goals, Lou? You know, climate change. The Secretary General always saying that the rate of mitigation isn't meeting the need of change that we are seeing in terms of the devastation that climate change is causing. The need for quality education, which is goal 4. Women's empowerment and gender equality, another goal. So really the message is, let us use the example of Nelson Mandela, the urgency with which he tackled issues of social inequality, and let's bring that to bear. What did Madiba tell us, Lulu? It's in your hands. The SDGs are in our hands, and time is running out. Next year we'll have 1 decade to be able to meet those goals, the various targets set out in the 17 goals of the SDGs. The world is not working fast enough. They're not working as a collective. And financing is also a very big issue in terms of achieving these goals. You saw the devastation caused by the number of cyclones that hit Southern Africa. That, I think, is a very good example of how everybody needs to get to work together, particularly developed nations that have the financing that is going to help the least developed countries in the world mitigate and build resilience towards the ills that confront us.
Now, Sherwin, the theme for this year is Take Action and Inspire Change. How did this resonate at the UN today?
Well, let me tell you where I am standing today. We came outside of our studio here at the United Nations. I am in the Visitors Plaza, essentially where visitors come into this global body. And right alongside me is what is being called the Peace Bench. It is an initiative by the Nobel Peace Center in Oslo. The mission of the Norwegians to the United Nations and the South Africans will be officially unveiling this Peace Bench in a ceremony here at the United Nations later today. It is called The Best Weapon, and they've used a quote from Madiba: the best weapon is to sit down and talk. And Lulu, if you look at the shape of this bench, if you look at the shape of this bench, if you look at the shape of this bench, it's an arch. And essentially the idea is if you were to sit on the upper end of the bench, right? If you were to sit on the right or on the left, you would then be forced to slide into the middle. And the idea around that is to create dialogue here at the multilateral institution of the world. If you slide down from one end to the other, your shoulders eventually touch each other. And that's the idea. We want people to talk. We want fighting to stop. If you look over there, there's a twisted pistol over there. It's an iconic image when you arrive at the United Nations. the idea, let's put away the guns, let's sit on the bench, let's get around the table and let's negotiate and let's put down our guns.
Sherwin, thank you so much for your time. I know you are pressed for time. We'll leave it there for now. That is our New York correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, joining us live from the UN in New York.